Welcome, everyone, to this Encore episode of the Global Missions Podcast. Our team is taking a break from regular production over the summer, but in the meantime, we have a request. If you haven't already, would you take just a few minutes to participate in our 2019 listener survey? We do this once a year, and we would really love to hear your feedback and suggestions about the program. Your input would be very helpful to us, as we're now making decisions about the content plan for the coming year. Of course, we're trying to make sure that it will be really beneficial to you, our listeners, as you share in God's great work of global missions. It's very easy to share in this. Simply visit globalmissionspodcast.com/survey, and we expect it'll take you about 5 minutes to complete it. On behalf of our team, thanks for considering this. We really appreciate your feedback. And now we're glad to re-present one of our most popular episodes.
Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a show for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work, both at home and to the ends of the earth. This episode is brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox, a new collection of trusted resources to help clarify and strengthen your participation in global missions. Visit us online at globalmissionstoolbox.com. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to many friends as Mags.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to introduce you to today's episode. We are going to unpack a relevant, hot topic: how to engage the next generation in missions. We're going to be joined by an expert who's extensively studied the experiences and the needs of Millennials and Generation Z, or Z if you're in Canada, and now helps equip others for effective intergenerational leadership. Enjoy the conversation. Our guest today on the Global Missions Podcast is Dr. Jolene Erlacher, who herself is an MK. Sometimes we abbreviate this idea, missionary kid, to MK, or sometimes called TCK, third culture kid, as her parents served in Mexico. Jolene has been involved in mobilizing and training mission teams for over 15 years. She's done extensive study. She's done extensive research on generational trends and is the author of 2 books, Millennials in Ministry, and a very recent book we'll talk about today, The Daniel Generation. She's a speaker and a consultant with the organization Leading Tomorrow, which exists to help organizations and churches and mission agencies equip and engage and empower the next generation for kingdom service. Jolene, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much. It's great to be a part of it.
Really looking forward to our conversation today. Just before we get to talking about strategy and our main topic today, please tell us just a little bit about this organization, Leading Tomorrow, and how you serve through that organization.
Yeah, so I actually founded Leading Tomorrow about 5 years ago after researching these topics and presenting on them for about 5 or 6 years, just recognizing that we really needed to provide resources to organizations, faith-based and otherwise, that were wrestling with some of these issues. So we primarily provide consulting, leadership coaching, and speaking and training around generational content.
I didn't know you were the founder as well, which is great. Appreciate your starting something that we really need. Jolene's ministry and work has been of benefit to the agency I serve with, Send, and we've appreciated her wisdom coming into our organization, and we're continuing to advance that. Now, you've got a new book, Jolene. Tell us just a little bit about the Daniel Generation. Why this book and why now?
So my new book, Daniel Generation, is geared both towards experienced leaders as well as developing leaders. As we look at the cultural and global changes that have occurred in the last 10 to 20 years, young leaders are really living and learning in an environment much different from that navigated by their mentors and their leaders and their teachers as they were young people. And so I really use the story of Daniel in this book to draw out lessons and strategies for young leaders who are leading an environment that's much different, just like Daniel led in Babylon, which was a place very different from Judah, where his leaders and mentors and parents had lived. And in this book, I also provide strategies and insights for those who are mentoring the next generation and encouraging them in what God is calling them to do in their season of leadership and ministry.
Well, very good. I just got a copy of it this morning, and I'm looking forward to it. And some of it, if it flows out, some of the book material today, I'll look forward to that too. Today, Jolene has prepared by getting ready to share 3 strategies with us, 3 strategies for helping to engage the next generation in missions. So just before we get to the strategies, Jolene, when we talk about the next generation, what are we referring to here? What does this mean?
When I use the term next generation, I'm usually referring to Millennials and Gen Z. So really anyone born from the early 1980s and later. And the reason I use that kind of marker is because we saw some significant societal changes in regards to parenting, education, technology, and even the way that we define truth and understand our world, really that emerged throughout the 80s and affected popular culture. So younger generations really have a different cultural worldview as well as some generational gaps from older generations. And that's why I really focus on them kind of as a cohort that's representing kind of the emerging culture.
The oldest of this group would be mid-30s now. So we're thinking about that group of folks who would be 35 and younger at this point. And they're going to be different, of course, in those groups themselves. But there's a little bit of a kind of a demographic idea of who we're speaking to particularly.
Yeah.
Well, let's come to these 3 strategies. What is the first strategy you suggest will be helpful in engaging these next generations in missions?
I think the first thing that we have to really make sure we do is understand the different perspectives on missions and understand how we're defining missions. I think traditionally in the church, we kind of understood what global missions meant, what our task was. But with younger believers and younger leaders, sometimes they have a little bit different view on missions and what it should look like. I often hear from young people even saying things like being a missionary is outdated or, is missions even necessary anymore? Or is the US or Canada or the West supposed to be doing missions, or is this more a task for the global South or majority world? So I think those are some of the things, really understanding the perspectives of younger generations, helping educate them. I think the needs can be really important. So fostering some conversation around that. I think when we think about the way that different generations view missions, it's also important to understand how different generations make decisions. And we're seeing a little bit of a shift in how we make decisions and decide what we're going to do. So I think that's also important to understand.
This is really important as we talk about cultivating prospective workers as well, I think. And we want to be careful here. If I can slip this in, Jolene, folks on our podcast that listen regularly will know we talk about goers and senders.
Yeah.
And I want to avoid a migration to think only of goers. It's going to be very important for some of these new generations to lay down their lives and go to a field. But I also want to make sure that we include the senders as well. They may not necessarily go to a mission field. But as we ask that question, which is more important, the goer or the sender, we know they're both critical. Getting missions, pursuing the Great Commission. I'm just sticking that in because I want all of our listeners to be thinking along these lines. But helping this generation make decisions. My generation, a little bit older than this group we're talking about, makes decisions in a certain way. What are some distinctives in the way this new generation makes decisions?
So we're seeing that traditionally, people often made decisions based on facts or logic, reason, and argument, a need that they heard that was maybe represented statistically in some way. And that really drove their actions. But more and more...
Really rational.
Exactly, yes. And that's really coming out of the age of reason, the Industrial Revolution, things of that nature. That's how our culture functioned. What we're seeing is a more emotional decision-making now, where stories and experience hold a lot more weight. And so even going back to your point of senders and goers, both senders and goers really need to understand the story of missions. They need to experience an element of missions to be able to engage it effectively, because that emotion really is a guiding factor in how they make decisions.
Just observing a difference between the generations. As we talk about being cross-cultural and missions, there's a crossing of cultures between generations here. Because some in my generation, on our rational, we make decisions based on facts, not emotion. That could be seen as a negative thing. A little concerned about just saying these aren't necessarily negatives, but they're realities we need to understand it. I don't know. Interact with that idea a little?
Yes, absolutely. I don't think it is. I think many of the changes are not right or wrong, good or bad. I think they're different. And I think that's where we really are seeing a cross-cultural element to this generational shift right now, because we see this as we do missions work cross-culturally, right? Where, you have a relational-driven culture versus a task-driven culture, or time versus event. Neither is right or wrong. It's just a different approach. But as we look to engage the next generation in missions, understanding how they're going to to identify and engage most effectively is important.
Yeah. Just another further observation on this, that demographic shift and how we make decisions and so forth. I'll speak from the agency side. Very often the leaders in our organization, team leaders or administrative leaders, are going to be of that rational group.
Mm-hmm.
I'll say I was going to say the more mature group.
More experienced.
The more experienced group, that's what we'll say. Yeah. But if they're even within the organization or within churches, very often the leaders will be of that older demographic band, and they're going to think in certain ways, and that could create a little friction between the two.
Absolutely. And this is where, at every level, whether it's mentoring young people in our local churches or leading them in short-term missions or engaging them once they are goers or senders, just understanding that this is a point where friction does come in. I think even for young people who are going, they often are wrestling because older generations who are partners want to hear the rational reasons. The younger people, their peers, want to hear the emotion behind their decisions and their work. They want to hear the story, not just the statistics, right? So often this is presenting a little bit extra work as well for young people as they're trying to navigate multiple audiences who are maybe looking for different things from them.
This is super. Now, I just wonder if there are some practical ways that churches can help build on this strategy. The strategy is understanding the next generation's perspective on missions. How can a church help address this?
Yeah, I think one of the best things we can do is really provide experiences that allow for young people to engage in things and even explore their own understanding. Because often what's happening is young people today are inundated with information, whether it's their social media feed, their news feed, opinions from friends. They just have so much information coming at them. And often they're founding their understanding on just bits and pieces of information. A post that someone put about their missions trip or an article that a friend posted about, why missions is bad, or whatever.
Right.
So they're often forming this opinion based on just snippets of information. If we can provide experiences where they can actually engage in missions in some way, whether it's a conversation with a missionary or whether it's going on a short-term trip or it's even a Bible study group where we're talking about what the Bible says about reaching the lost or the hurting. These are just ways where we can engage them and start to foster that conversation that helps us understand where they're at as well as helps them explore their own understanding. But that really has to happen in the context of community and story and experiences again, right? So not just necessarily like a missions report, but something that's really going to engage them at the heart level.
Just that little bit of a distinction. It's not that older leaders don't have hearts too, but we might lead with our heads and have both and here. Healthy balance. So the first strategy, understanding the next generation's perspective on missions. What's the second strategy you suggest for helping?
I think the second thing that's absolutely essential for young leaders, and I mean, even this last week, I was at a conference and interviewing a panel of millennials who are engaged in missions in various ways. And one of the main factors that contributes to a young person remaining in their faith, but also remaining in their calling or contributing to God's work is having an older believer, more experienced believer who walks alongside them, who believes in them, who encourages them, who mentors them. So I see this as critical. When we look around our churches or our circles of influence and we see a young person who is seeking the Lord, who is asking questions about how to engage in God's work, to really step into that young person's life and mentor them. Because the reality is that there are fewer and fewer young people in our society today who even believe in God, who believe in Scripture, who believe in truth. We know that 4%, only 4% of Gen Z holds a biblical worldview compared to 10% of boomers. So these young people have more and more obstacles to overcome just in even justifying their faith to themselves or to their peers, much less than taking action on that faith. So having an older mentor to help them process and own what it is that they believe is absolutely critical.
It feels like mentorship it's on a rise. It seems like a wise rise, I think. But why would you say it's so important for this next generation?
Well, one of the reasons is that natural forms of mentorship are kind of fading away. So in the past, if I needed to learn something, let's say I needed to learn how to fix my car, or I needed to learn how to paint the wall, or, whatever it was, to cook a meal, I needed to learn how to bake a cake. I had to go to someone and ask Dad how or grandpa or an uncle, teach me how to fix my car, ask mom or a neighbor how to bake a cake. Kids do not have to have that anymore. They just YouTube it, right? So they are going to the internet. Even in classrooms, I teach continuing education courses for K-12 teachers. And what we're seeing is teachers are no longer the conveyors of information. They are facilitators of interpretation. And so they are helping guide students as they process the information, because students have more access to information than even teachers do. So we are seeing the role of mentor kind of fading away because kids are going to the internet. So as a result, there's this need for mentorship because it's not just happening naturally anymore. And often the adults in young people's lives are looking at their devices, not looking at them, right? So in the church, we have to be so much more intentional because young people are not getting the wisdom, the practical insights of having just built-in mentors in their lives. So they have lots of information, but not always the ability to apply it. And that's where this idea of mentorship is really becoming important and having to be more intentional.
It's very good. I wonder if we can go to the practical side of this. When we think of a local church, how can a local church go about lifting this mentorship element, strengthening this?
I think the first thing to do is to really give people understanding that mentorship is not telling people what to do. It's engaging their questions. What I say is that the two best strategies we can develop as leaders who want to develop the next generation is understanding how to ask open-ended questions and how to actively listen, because they need time to process. If they want a lecture or they want information, they can get that in a second. What they need is a safe place, someone who's mature, experienced, and wise to help them process what they're thinking. So equipping our body to really know how to ask those questions and actively listen is critical. And then I just encourage people in local churches, look around and find a young person who you see potential in and figure out how to meet a need in their life. Figure out how to connect to their life. If it's a young mom, offer to babysit. If it's a young professional, offer to help him with a project. So find a way to connect. If it's a high school student, go to their basketball games. Find a way to connect with that young person where they're at, meet a need, and just be that person who is asking questions and wants to listen to them. And that's one of the best ways to just begin those mentorship opportunities.
Some super ideas there, some very practical ideas. That's for the second strategy. The first strategy, we need to work to understand the next generation's perspective on missions. Second strategy, lift mentorship and guidance through multi-generational relationships. In a moment, I'm going to ask Jolene about the third strategy. Just before we get to that, we'd like to share with you this resource, which we hope would be helpful to you and your church.
Would you like your short-term mission experience to ignite a greater passion for the Great Commission? Consider the Go Journal, an electronic and paper journaling tool for people involved in short-term missions. Go Journal has unique templates that guide users in reflecting on their experiences and the lessons God is teaching them before, during, and after their short-term mission. The Go Journal is available as a browser-based web app, as well as a printed workbook. Visit gojournal.org to find out more. And now, back to today's conversation.
Okay, we're back with Jolene Erlacher, who is helping us understand 3 strategies for engaging the next generation or generations in missions. The first 2 were understanding this generation's perspective on missions, and the second, lifting mentorship and guidance. Jolene, what is the third strategy you share with us?
The third strategy I would add is just providing on-ramps. So what I mean by that is helping young people who do want to engage in missions in some way, whether it's as a goer or as a sender, really know how to do that effectively. When my parents went to the field 30 some years ago, they had one missionary that their church supported. And so when they felt the call, they called up that agency and went, right? That was the connection. Nowadays, a young person who wants to engage in missions in any way, Googles, and they get hundreds of options. And so often we're seeing young people struggle with decision paralysis. So one of the things I see that those mentors can help do is really help young people understand themselves, how God has wired them and gifted them, and help them explore the options that are out there for them that would be good on-ramps.
I love the analogy of on-ramps because when you drive onto a freeway, an interstate, or in Canada here, it's the 400 series or the Trans-Canada Highway, you don't instantly go to full speed. You need an opportunity to spin up to that and work through the gears before you're in full flow. So that analogy is helpful. Again, if we can look to some practical ideas, what practical suggestions do you have for churches to help provide these on-ramps?
Yeah, I think often in churches, we kind of focus on the missionaries who are already on the field and how do we help them or support them. So I think even as a church or as a missions committee, really doing some research as we're looking at the young people who are coming back from short-term missions trips maybe, or young people we see who have an interest in missions, researching some opportunities and really kind of vetting those for young people. So we have some organizations or some opportunities that we recommend. And then as we're mentoring, also identifying what our young people are passionate about and gifted in, and doing some of the research and vetting for them and saying, here are some organizations I recommend, or researching them together. So really just walking with them and helping them find those options and even talking about them, the options of like midterm missions or giving regularly to missions, So having some of those things laid out, and then some of the options that they have that we have vetted or recommend for them in those regards.
A number of churches that we're familiar with now are actually predetermining which agencies they will recommend, or they've pre-vetted the agency. They're called preferred agencies because they've gotten to know those organizations, and it kind of bounds the data set a little bit.
Right.
Instead of having thousands of options, it says, well, here are half a dozen agencies, and 3 of them are doing what we're talking about here, something like that. Just a few episodes back in our season this year, there was an episode with Paul Seeger that aims to help churches and individuals choose a mission agency. Which questions should a church or an individual ask as they're looking for that alignment? And perhaps that would be a helpful bit of wisdom if you're considering this as well. Are there other practical examples that you would like to mention, Jolene, that would help people through this decision paralysis?
I think the one thing that I find really, really helpful, I'm a leadership coach as well, and just doing things like spiritual gifts test or personality profiles or strengths finder with those young people who are kind of exploring what God has for them can really help us guide the discussion as far as what God has gifted them to do and what their passions are about. What we're seeing with young millennials and Gen Z is they really want to engage their skills. They don't want to be a round peg in a square hole. So they want to be in a place where their skills and their personality and passions can really be fruitful. So helping young people understand who they are can be another great piece to helping them get on the right on-ramp to their involvement with missions.
Super. Very often an agency will contribute some of what Jolene has described with different tests to raise personal awareness or self-awareness, we call it. But to move this into the church, I think would be even better for the local church community that knows and loves these young people. To participate in that at that level would be even better. So some great ideas, great advice here. So those are the 3 strategies that Jolene recommends we consider. Their starting points. Number 1, understanding the next generation's perspective on missions. Number 2, lifting mentorship and guidance for those in the next generations. And thirdly, providing on-ramps rather than expecting that everybody can just spin up really quickly, providing on-ramps to help them understand themselves and make good decisions. Well, Jolene, we worked hard to get through a lot of material quickly here. It's been excellent. We've just scratched the surface. I'm going to ask you in just a minute about resources that you would recommend. While Jolene prepares for that, I'll just remind our listeners we prepare show notes for each episode of the Global Missions Podcast, and you can find that on the website, and there we will include a summary of this episode as well as any links that are relevant here and the resources. Jolene, what would you recommend to our listeners?
Well, just in understanding high school, college students, if that's the group you're working with, Tim Elmore, his website growingleaders.org is great. And his book, Marching Off the Map, is just a great resource as we look at training and engaging the next generation effectively. So I highly recommend his work. As far as in mission specifically, a friend of mine, Jim Ramo, wrote a great book, Millennials and Mission, just about how young people are engaging mission in the world. And then, of course, my books, Millennials and Ministry, as well as Daniel Generation, both grapple with this idea of how do young people engage effectively, and how do we retain them in the work of God long term as well?
And I can just speak to that as well and encourage you to consider Jolene's writing. I know her first book, not the second one, as I said, but just have appreciated her wisdom, and Jim's as well. Excellent resources. If our listeners would like to contact you again, Jolene, reach out and learn more from you, how could they do that?
Yep, they can just email me at jolene@leadingtomorrow.org or visit my website, which is just leadingtomorrow.org.
Very good. We'll include that in the show notes so that you can follow up. Our last question here, Jolene, is just to imagine that we have the opportunity together with you to sit with the leaders of a local church. Perhaps they're part of the missions committee. There might be a pastor that's involved in encouraging mission and missional thinking. If you could sit together with that group today, what would you say to them?
Include young people in everything that you're doing. Intentionally invite them to be a part of the missions committee, to be a part of leading programs and activities, to be a part of guiding decisions. We are hemorrhaging young leaders in the church today, and the engagement from experienced, mature leaders is really one of the things that's encouraging them and retaining them. So just really being sure we're bringing along a Timothy or a Joshua in everything that we're doing.
Wonderful advice. Jolene, thank you so much for spending this time with us, with our community today. It's been very rich, and we appreciate your sharing, and just pray for the Lord's blessing as you continue to serve him in these ways.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, that concludes our conversation today with Jolene. I've got to say, I personally found this to be a really stimulating conversation, and lots to think about personally in my leadership style, and who are the Timothys in my life and in my organization, and how will we really step toward the potential of these great young leaders. It also occurred to me while we were talking about this that those of us serving now in leadership roles will need an attitude of humility as we learn and adapt in order to embrace the potential of these rising generations. May the Lord give us wisdom and grace to know how best to cultivate this and unleash the potential of these precious young people. Well, thanks for joining us. Remember, you can find show notes for today's episode and all our episodes at globalmissionspodcast.com. And you can connect with us on social media through Twitter and Facebook. We're always glad to hear from you and to hear your suggestions for topics or interviews you'd like to consider. We also really appreciate the reviews that you would leave if you found this valuable. Help others discover it as well by leaving a review in your favorite podcast app. That's all for now. This episode was brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox and produced by Send International and the Jaffrey Center for Global Initiatives in collaboration with other like-minded agencies. On behalf of our team, thanks for listening. We invite you to join us again in 2 weeks when we'll continue to explore this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.